My name is Nick Floyd. I have a long history with Magic the Gathering. I created the Dandan variant. Now I'm creating this. Welcome to Magic Storytime. This is Danecdote number 2, Embracing the Fish. If I'm known in magic circles at all, it's for being the creator of Forgetful Fish, or Dandan. Here is more of its story. So after the trip where I had the initial idea to make a variant deck around Memory Lapse, whenever it was, and playing out of the same library, I immediately started looking for cards for it. There were a handful of cards that dealt with the top of the library that were easy choices. The win con was not as obvious. Just before the Homeland set was released in the fall of 1995, Wizards of the Coast released a reprint set called Chronicles. Though there were a ton of issues with the set, which is not the type of magic history this channel is about, it was a prominent set at the time and I bought a lot of it. There was a lot out there to buy. I had taken notice of the Arabian Nights reprint in it called Dandan. It was cheap at 2 mana, the same converted mana cost as Memory Lapse. It was high power for its cost at 4, but fragile with a toughness of only 1. Those characteristics made me look at it closely. It also had 2 major drawbacks. It could not attack unless your opponent had an island, which would not be an issue for a shared library deck as islands would be the central land in the deck. Additionally, it died if at any time its controller didn't control an island. So the question was, how would the players kill their opponent's Dandans? Blocking, obviously, but what else? I knew of Magical Hack, an oddly rare card which could edit a land type on a card, and there were multiple revised and 4th edition copies no one wanted, including me, in my binders. An instant, actually an interrupt at the time, at only 1 mana, keeping the speed of the deck up, could kill a Dandan in a fun and unexpected manner. That was it! Dandan's land flaw was the key to removal. And that's how I chose it. It was easy to cast at 2 mana, a decent threat at 4 power, and had a funny flaw that was the key to removal and utilized cheap, crappy cards I had in my trade binder. So I built the first Dandan deck, which is what I called it until 2016, in 1996 from cards and sets released in the years since I had begun playing in 94, and sets that would be released soon after. Brainstorm, Mystical Tutor, Mindbend, Ray of Command, and Vision Charm, all of which are still on my current list and the list I released in 2016. Many other cards have been replaced as new cards were released or I discovered that a worthy card had been released while I was not paying attention to Magic. I'll talk about some of those upgrades in future Danecdotes. The first version contained 60 cards, which Type 2 standard decks contain. But I hated the idea of decking in a shared library game, so I added 2 copies of Time Twister to avoid decking and to help refill the hands. I proxied these, of course, because as I have mentioned, I missed Alpha, Beta, and Unlimited, and I didn't own any Time Twisters. Stay tuned to the end of this video to see how I have fully embraced the decking win condition with a new Dandanless Dandan deck. As I mentioned in my Forgetful Fish Google Docs designer notes, link in the description, I took the first Dandan deck to US Nationals after qualifying at Regionals, as seen in my first 2 videos, and played with a friend during downtime. We'll call my friend Ivan because, well, his name's Ivan. Ivan and I had a great time playing the Dandan deck and laughed and laughed. It was about this time that I knew that the Dandan deck was something special and had potential to spread among players if enough players tried it. Not long after I built the first version, and played it quite a bit, I started to get good at playing blue control. As a result, I took Big Blue to regionals and played Counter Post at Nationals in the summer of '97. I carried the first Dandan deck with me for 2 decades wherever I lived. I played it with friends in Rock Springs, where I grew up, stories to share someday. Friends in Laramie, Wyoming, where I went to college, stories to share in time. Friends in Montana, where I spent college summers, stories to share another time. And strangers in Florida, where I lived for a short time. When I moved to Illinois in 2012, I shared the Dandan deck with an employee at an LGS. We'll call him Dan because his name is Dan. No, seriously. Dan thought Dandan was great, and not just because his name was Dan. But this got me interested in Dandan again, and major upgrades came that year. A couple years later, Dan owned his own games shop, and I was in there to play some Commander. And I looked over and noticed that the playmat that Dan was playing on was Dandan artwork. I walked over and pointed it and said, "That's awesome." He said he got it, or was given it, because his name was Dan. But remembering my Dandan deck from years before, he said that if I wanted it, he'd sell it to me. Of course I wanted it. So I bought a Dandan playmat from Dan, so I could play the Dandan deck on Dan's Dandan playmat. For years I used that playmat and wanted to have players I introduced the Dandan deck to sign it. But first I wanted to have the Forgetful Fish logo I had designed put on the upper right corner. That proved easier said than done, but I was able to get it on there between learning that the variant had taken off from the Rhystic Studies video, link in the description, thanks Sam, and going to the MagicCon Minneapolis a month later. Sam of Rhystic Studies and Braden and Cal, who are featured in Sam's video, were among the first to sign it. I wish I could take it back in time and get other friends that I will mention in my Danecdotes to sign, like Ivan and Forrest and Dan. And I wish I had used a different silver marker for signatures. I thought Sharpie brand would be great, but no. Most of the earliest signatures have nearly disappeared, and my logo has begun coming off too. I'll work on getting that stenciled on. Well, that's it for the Danecdote. Now here's the bonus I promised. A few weeks ago I saw a short video on YouTube of two players playing Dandan, and the game came down to who was forced to draw from an empty library, and it was pretty great. By this time a bunch of players have had more games of Dandan than I have, but I've had a few games end well running the deck out of cards. Back when I was first playing the deck with Ivan, he tried to force decking all the time, refusing to play Time Twister. I was thinking about that and wondering if I could cut Dandan out completely and make decking the only win con, so you don't need to track life at all. And it turns out I could. I call it Forget the Fish, and a link to the new Google Docs is in the video's description. It presents two versions. The first is direction on making virtually any Dandan deck Dandanless, as a simulation of a game of Dandan with that particular deck that comes down to forcing a draw from an empty library using my Forgetful Fish list as an example. The second is a curated Forget the Fish deck that splashes green for greater dynamic endgames and a fight over who can't draw a card from the library. It adds a number of artifacts, which finally makes the third mode of Vision Charm sometimes relevant. Both play quite quickly and avoid the sometimes long games of Dandan, especially ones that go to decking, just due to the quickly depleting deck, and it's a lot of fun. Take a look, the rules document will explain fully. But like Forgetful Fish and other Magic variants, only the experience of actually playing it can really show it off. It's hard to see the greatness just from reading about it. Well, that's it for my second Danecdote. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and share this video. Thanks for watching Magic Storytime.